To have a college, an academic institution, name one of their colleges after her, it's just enormous.
In January 2021, it was revealed that the University of York's newest college would be named after legendary 18th century diarist Anne Lister. During her lifetime, Anne wrote over 5 million words, detailing her life written almost entirely in a secret code. Better known to many as she was back then as Gentleman Jack, Anne Lister has since been dubbed as the first modern lesbian, marking this a historical moment for the university as the first college to be named not only after a woman, but also an LGBTQ+ figure. Following the huge success of Sally Wainwright's hit series Gentleman Jack, Anne quickly became described as a rock star lesbian as viewers tuned in each week to see how her extraordinary story would unfold. However, the show only shows us a snippet of Anne's life. Follow along as we delve into the life and legacy of Anne Lister and her untold connection to York, starting at the very beginning. Since the naming of the new college, we decided to visit a number of places in Yorkshire that were significant throughout Anne's life. Chatting to experts in the Anne Lister field, we wanted to find out as much as we possibly could about who she really was, beginning with the woman who first lit the fuse.
My name is Helena Whitbread, and I've been studying the Anne Lister journals for 40 years. I knew that I'd vaguely heard of Anne Lister, a woman who lived at Shibden Hall, but I didn't know anything about her at all. So I went into the archives and I asked the archivist to put some of her letters up. So he said to me, "Do you know she kept a journal?" Right, and a little sentence absolutely changed my life. So all the coded bits, I said, well, these look more difficult than the letters. And so I said, has the code been cracked? And he said, yes, and he brought me a copy out. I photocopied that and 50 pages of the journal, and I took them home. And from then on, I've lived this adventure, if you like, working through the journals for the next 5 years until I've got enough material for my 2 books.
Whilst Helena's books are now so widely popular, when The Secret Diaries of Miss Anne Lister was first published, she was worried about what kind of reaction it might attract from the public, especially considering the year in which it went out into the world.
Everything was like a moral compromise. I remember when I was on the One show, the BBC, and the guy, do you think it's ethical to do this? And I said, well, look, history is history, and history is fair game, and besides, why shouldn't lesbians have their own sexual history? The goodness knows there's enough around for straight people. So I had to weigh my feeling that I was going to be run out of town. I remember my headmaster, when I was teaching, Section 28 was coming out, where homosexuality wasn't to be taught in schools or talked about or anything. And I had to go to him, obviously, because I was a Catholic teacher teaching in a Catholic school. And I said, I've got this book coming out, and it's about lesbian sexuality. I said, I will understand, if you're going to have difficulty in continuing to employ me, really. And they said, no. He said, if you have any trouble with staff, pupils, or parents, send them to me. So I thought that was very liberal of him. And then I obviously gave him a copy of my book, later when it came out. And he came to me one day in the staff room and he said, I've read your book. He said, and I want to say to you, you have lit a slow fuse.
Helena did just that. So much so that after all this time, the legacy of Anne Lister caught interest for many, more recently the University of York.
When I came to the University of York a couple of years ago, one of the things that really struck me was how important the colleges were. And I think it's really important because it's one of those things that binds students to their university, and most other universities don't have it. I think it's a real advantage for York. When we had a new college to name, we thought we ought to do something a bit different than what we'd done in the past. So we had a big open exercise. We asked any member of our community to make suggestions, and the one that appeared most was Anne Lister.
The minute I heard that the University of York is doing a college naming process based on criteria that makes sense for Anne Lister, right? Connection to Yorkshire, kind of ethical significance, I just immediately contacted Sally. I said, Sally, look at this opportunity, should we do it? Sally, of course, said, why would we not do this? So we drafted a nomination. We didn't know, would there be a lot of support coming from other folks for Anne Lister, but we had reason to think, well, maybe there would be. And I had an email full of hearts and black top hats, and it's happened.
I was so excited, I didn't know what to do with the information. I was like, I couldn't believe it.
I was absolutely wonderstruck. I didn't even know they were building a new college, you know, but then it seemed so absolutely spot on, you know, the people who chose the title.
I was delirious. I mean, the idea of a figure as inspirational as Anne Lister is for so many people, becoming a part of the durable landscape in such a public way. I mean, we were pretty giddy about it, and so proud in a way of the University of York, which I didn't really know before, for the ethical gumption to choose her and put her name there.
I think it's so important to have a college named after somebody like Anne Lister because it gives real expression to the values to which I think we're committed. First of all, I think it says welcome. It says welcome to York for groups in our society, women and gay people who've had disadvantages. So I think it's an important statement.
I think the fact that it's York University is special for a number of reasons. First of all, Anne spent a lot of time in York and grew here. She started to become the person she wanted to be in York.
But it's also, in a sense, a challenge to us to do more to make equality a reality.
I just couldn't believe it because I thought of all Anne's ambitions to go to university, and now there's an actual college at a university named after her.
One thing that struck me when I was looking at the history of the foundation of the University of York, something the first Vice-Chancellor said, and that was widening opportunity to access higher education is something we should care about more than almost anything else. I think we're in that territory. We are saying that we are open to people of all backgrounds, despite the way that society has produced disadvantage in various ways. We are open. We want everyone to fulfill their potential.
In some ways, Anne Lister couldn't go to college. But she kind of did go to college, and it kind of was in York.
In 1805, I think her father decided it was time she went to school. He chose the Manor School at York, which is a school for young ladies. She entered sometime in 1805, but unfortunately had to be removed in 1806. It was odd because her father knew exactly what would happen, and he said, I am quite sure that Anne will do everything in her power to ensure that she is not at the school very long. And he meant, of course, not that she would study hard and have all her qualifications out, but what he meant was that her behaviour would be so outrageous that they would be asked to remove her, which apparently is what happened. But during that period, 1805 to 1806, she met Eliza Raine, who was a young, beautiful Anglo-Indian girl, and they shared a room up at the top called the Slope. There have been certain theories put around as to why would they put Anne Lister in the Slope with an Anglo-Indian pupil. Did it smack of racism that the Anglo-Indian girl, you know, had to be segregated? This, of course, led them into a very intimate situation, and they very quickly became lovers, and they addressed each other as husband and wife, and obviously the husband. She had to come away then, 1806, and Eliza had to stay. So through Eliza's reign, the circle widened. Halifax was never going to be big enough for Anne. The manor school was the catalyst, if you like, for Anne, being introduced to the medical circle and that, and then being invited to big houses like Langton Hall. So she was at this house party at Langton, and who should be there but Mariana Belcombe. And that triggered off this wonderful love affair that they had. As Anne writes later to Mariana, how well I remember the evening and the blue handkerchief introduction. In those days, if a woman wanted to attract a man's attention, she would drop a handkerchief and he would pick it up. Oh, madame, your handkerchief, pick it up. So the blue handkerchief introduction was probably Mariana's way of telling Anne that she fancied her. In my opinion, Mariana Belcombe was the love of Anne's life. I don't think she ever recreated that or felt as passionately about anybody else. And I think York satisfied something inside Anne, her ambition, her desire to live a life of refinement, if you like, and learning. It became more or less a spiritual home, really. It was like a springboard for her. So it moved her on from being a provincial young woman who wasn't important, only in her own little town of Halifax. And it just opened doors, really, and gave her ambitions.
Knowing how much York as a city meant to Anne Lister, we next visited the college team during the construction period to find out how they intend to transfer her legacy into the values of the college.
I'm Paula Montenegro and I'm the administrator of Anne Lister College.
My name is Sarah Hay. I'm the college manager for Anne Lister College. I would like Anne Lister to feel like a home. I would like students to come home from the lectures and seminars in the day, feel comfortable to be in the space, playing ping pong in the atrium, whether they want to go and read a quiet book in the hub, to feel comfortable with the people around them, to feel like it's a safe environment, and to be able to pursue their passions and interests.
I think the most exciting thing is just that opportunity to have some legacy at the university, setting up something brand new from scratch. It doesn't happen often.
The ethos and the values of the college will be not predetermined by me, but by the students.
We had the shield, the new shield design for Anne Lister College.
I'm Holly Burden and I am the winner of the College Shield competition, and also I'm on the Anne Lister founding committee as Community and Orientation Officer. Looking at the Lister family shield itself, I thought the 3 stars were iconic, and I really wanted to introduce them into my design as much as possible. But I didn't want it to be too heraldic in a sense. So I made sure to kind of integrate the lettering in as much the style of what is thought to be her signature and her handwriting as possible. The code spells out, have some courage, which is a direct quote from the diaries. And yeah, I thought that would make a great kind of motto for the college and to inspire students. On top of the shield, you'll notice there's a top hat instead of the traditional kind of helmet that you would see on a normal kind of like coat of arms. Although there's no actual evidence that Anne Lister ever wore a top hat, that's obviously a nod to Gentleman Jack, the series by Sally Wainwright.
I've always been familiar with Shibden Hall, and I think I've always been familiar with who Anne Lister was. This portrait in the hall, I always knew it was Anne Lister, but I didn't necessarily know a huge amount about her. And as a teenager in the sort of late 70s and early 80s, I started to become aware that she was gay, and that there were things about her that people didn't want to tell you about, and it was really hard to find out anything about her. This is pre the internet where you can't just press buttons and find things out.
I was very fortunate to have been given Helena Whitbread's first book, I Know My Own Heart, from a friend who was leaving to go live in New York. And it was Helena's first book that inspired me to learn more about Anne Lister.
When Jill published Female Fortune in 1998, that was when the first time I got a real massive, big hit of just who Anne Lister was and just how exciting she was. The first thought I had was, oh my God, I've got to dramatise this. So I got to know Jill and I got to know Helena, and then I started reading the diaries myself. And I first pitched an idea for the drama in 2003, and it just got rejected by everyone. Because the time wasn't right, I guess. No one had heard of her. No one had heard of me much. So I just went away and wrote other things, but I never stopped working on the journals and transcribing the journals, and certainly the idea of writing a drama about her never went away.
And I ended up at Shibden Hall a few weeks later after reading Helena's first book, and then I met Helena, and it was amazing. And I remember just walking out of the front at Shibden Hall, just me here, a guide, and then Helena was sat on the wall. And I was in my 20s. I didn't know what to expect, except that I knew I was extremely excited, not only to have been able to go around Shibden Hall for the first time, but also to be meeting Helena. Gosh, Helena, can you believe it's 30 years?
I know.
We were talking about that the other day, weren't we?
Yes, we were.
I remember you came, even then you were full of information. You had a bag full of information for me.
I think you were my first fan.
Yeah, I probably was your first fan,
my first reader.
First of many fans, Helena.
Because the book went very quietly into publication. There wasn't any big hoo-ha, you know.
Yeah. 1988 when you published, it was a different time, wasn't
different.
it? And you can't anticipate just how brave you were in publishing that book at that time.
No.
So you really, really were a trailblazer.
I see that now. And at the time I was just so immersed in this wonderful journal and all. It was just myself and the words on the page. And obviously the atmosphere at Shibden, which I've been coming here since I was 3 years old. Yeah.
And this is what's really interesting about anybody coming to Anne Lister for the first time. Anything to do with Anne Lister, it kind of still happens at her pace.
It has to sort of marinate for so long.
I think you were a Halifax person.
Yes.
And yet, you know, it was many, many years later before you started to work on her diaries.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting because, you know, Anne died in 1840. Everything has a place in time.
Yes.
And even though your book was written in 1988 and it didn't have the same impact as it's having now.
No, because it took Gentleman Jack to do that.
After Happy Valley was on in 2015 and it was quite a big hit, and I went to a meeting at the BBC and they asked me what I wanted to do next. And I'd got several ideas, and I said there's one about this woman who owned Shibden Hall in Halifax called Anne Lister, and I explained what the drama would be about her marrying another woman and her running her estate and that kind of thing. And Charlotte, who's the controller of BBC One, said to me, well, which one are you most excited about? And I said, well, Anne Lister, no question. And she said, oh, well, let's do that then. You know, I've had TV shows on in the past that have dived, and sometimes you feel it's because it's just the wrong time rather than there's actually anything wrong with it. It's kind of hard to talk about the effect for me because it was quite a shock. I didn't see that coming. You know, when you write a TV show, you hope people will watch it, you hope people will get it, you hope you get good reviews. But the Gentleman Jack effect, as it's now become known, was something that none of us really anticipated.
The month before Gentleman Jack came out, my book sold at the rate of 69 copies a month. So I had 69 readers. At the end of the first month after Gentleman Jack came out, it had sold 22,500. So from 69 readers, it jumped to 22,500 in 4 weeks.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's the impact.
The impact of Gentleman Jack.
From 1988 to 2019, It was very, very low-key. It was under the radar.
A handful of people working on the diaries
Yeah, it's all
sporadically.
academic.
You, of course, were the person that was constantly
Yeah.
working on them with your biography.
I think Anne Lister's diary is a hidden masterpiece of the English literary tradition, nothing less. And I feel Gentleman Jack honors that fact.
People say, why are you still working on Anne Lister 40 years later? But when I went into the archives, and I was introduced by the young archivist there to the journals, and as soon as I started reading, when I got it home, I had this sense of destiny about it. Do you know what I mean? That this wasn't just...
I identify with that, Helena, because I knew that when I'd read your first book and then when I'd met you, I just knew somehow Anne Lister was going to be pivotal in my life.
Absolutely,
I didn't know how, I didn't know when.
No.
But Sally knew that I could transcribe the diaries. Bearing in mind, this is 2017, and pretty much Anne Lister has stood static for all of those years. She's not really out in the mainstream. And so Sally approached me and I started transcribing for Series 1. And I think for Series 1, I think we covered over, it was about 300,000 words we had for Series 1. And across Series 1 and Series 2, in excess, I would say, coming up towards 1 million words. Well, initially, when I was brought in to work on Gentleman Jack, it was purely to transcribe diaries. And Sally needed the work pretty quick, and the team needed the work very quickly. But then Sally and I realised in between me transcribing diaries, we were having a lot of conversations about Anne. And so then I was brought on as advisor. And so I was involved in lots of the early script meetings and was part of the conversations that we had and about what the narrative was going to be. And certainly, I felt very privileged, and it was an honour to be able to be part of that in the early days.
It was definitely a turning point for you, wasn't it? A hinge on
of
how
course
your
it was
life
for
turned different.
many women who come to Anne Lister for the first time, and especially because of now through Gentleman Jack, who've never felt represented.
Yes.
Certainly on mainstream TV or in mainstream drama, and how their stories are now being told. Just thinking back, Helen, to that first time we met, all those years ago, nearly 30 years ago, and how could we have ever anticipated that scenario?
We were in on the secret, you and I, weren't we?
It was an amazing time, and it's only now, all those years later, and I think back just how special it was meeting you. For the first few years, I was probably Helena's little apprentice. She taught me how to read the diaries. She loaned me copies of the diaries, and we did so much together. I did many Anne Lister pilgrimages with Helena Whitbread, and I remember making lots of mistakes and struggling with reading the code and struggling with reading the plain hand. But we forged such an amazing, beautiful friendship. And I do remember Helena saying to you one day, "Where are all the women?" When we were here once, I said, "Why aren't the women coming here?"
Yes, that's right.
And it's just because they... Anne Lister was not out there enough at that point.
No, she wasn't. It was very much kept within the academic world, wasn't it?
Yeah, and even then, not an awful lot.
No.
It's interesting now that, we used to talk about, why there weren't more women, more people knowing about Anne Lister, and yet 30 years later, we find we've got an Anne Lister College being named after her.
Nothing. I know nothing about Anne Lister. Is it a new college?
I had really no idea who Anne Lister was.
Didn't know very much about Anne Lister before the Gentleman Jack series came out.
Obviously getting involved and becoming a staff member in Anne Lister College, learning more about her and what an amazing woman she was.
What Anne Lister actually did was she slowly constructed her lesbian identity and actually wrote about it.
Suddenly, LGBTQ people have this dazzling ancestor that they didn't know about.
It's impossible to say why Anne Lister is so special in in a few words.
Anne Lister was unique. She was a person in her own right, and I think we would welcome students to come to the college to pursue their own dreams and interests.
After delving into the part of history in which we discovered why York was so important to Anne, we now jump forward to the present day, with the first group of students move into their new homes in the Anne Lister College.
As community and orientation officer in Welcome Week, it was all about engaging students. And yeah, I think a lot of people have learnt a lot, because some people who came here didn't really know that much, I don't think, about her.
I don't know too much about Anne Lister, but I know that it's about the LGBTQ community, so it's a very inclusive sort of college, which is one of the reasons why I did apply to be here.
I think now there's a lot more awareness, and I think most students are pretty inspired by her story. People thought, like, as a stereotype, this would attract all the LGBT students, but it is partially true.
I kind of feel like it's got a better vibe here. Everyone's accepting and kind of nice to be here.
I think it's really interesting, actually. I think it's so cool that I'm part of the first college named after a woman.
I know that she was a 19th century landowner based in Halifax and Yorkshire, and that she went to school in what is now the King's Manor campus of York. And also she was one of the, I think, the first recorded lesbian marriages within in the UK, and that happened in York as well, which is pretty cool.
So the Holy Trinity Church on Goodrum Gate in York is very special in Anne Lister's diaries, in the Anne Lister story, because it's where she sealed her union with Anne Walker in 1834. The Holy Trinity Church is the most beautiful romantic church on Goodrum Gate, down a little alleyway, and I think I first went to that church 30 years ago almost with Helena Whitbread, and I remember going up that little windy path for the first time on a very, very hot summer's day, and sitting in the box pews and thinking about that really special iconic day when Anne Walker and Anne Lister took the sacrament together. And I think, of course, now in York it's a place of pilgrimage for women. And I think back to the, the day we filmed there at Series 1 in Gentleman Jack. And I remember watching Sir Anne and Sophie and walking up to the aisle and kneeling. And my goodness, it was like being in that moment 200 years ago. And I think even the lead up to it, where we see Sir Anne walking up the path and we see her looking back and breaking the fourth wall, and she says, you come and join me. For me, it's one of the most special moments of a Series 1 in Gentleman Jack. It still gives me goosebumps when I watch it. We see the joy on Anne Lister's face in that episode, in that scene. We see how important it is to her in that episode, in that scene. That she's able to do that with Anne Walker, and that they're now married. What's very interesting, of course, when you look at the diaries and you go back to that day and you read that extract, it doesn't take up a lot of the diary. It's just a small passage, but it is a very, very important part of Anne Lister's story.
In the same way that Anne is a very small part of this church's story, this church is a very small part of Anne's story. I'm Ed van der Molen. I'm the site coordinator, or possibly the custodian, depending on which you prefer, here at Holy Trinity. And I do most of the day-to-day management of the site. I look after the volunteer team, make sure they're happy, recruit more volunteers, do interpretation, and help out visitors with whatever they might need. She wasn't obviously resident in the parish here because she lived in Shibden Hall. She had a lot of friends in York, so we assume that she was visiting some friend or connection in York and then happened to come here for worship. Her diary mentions that she was extremely conscientious about going to service every Sunday if she could, and she said prayers regularly kind of by herself, so she was clearly an extremely religious woman. But the connection of this church is likely just because it happened to be near where she was staying. There's no, as far as we're aware, particular emotional or spiritual or personal connection between Anne and the church. It just happened to be where she was, and presumably she then went on her way after, and we have no record of her coming back. In a way, it's kind of ships passing in the night in that respect. You know, she comes here very briefly and then kind of carries on. So we're quite lucky in that respect, you know, because we just happen to have been where she was. The pivotal thing is not so much it happening as us realizing that it happened, and us as historians and us as people who experience the church, putting that in its context in the history of the building and saying, actually, look, nothing changed afterwards for the daily lives of people using that church. But what that does is it does give us that insight into those daily lives that suggests actually there's more here going on than we thought there is. There's a lot more variation in belief and in worship and in the way that people understand their own identities and their own place within a social scheme.
Anne was very self-assured about who she was. She was always having internal dialogues about how she understood herself, but also how she was perceived by other people. I think what's very interesting is that when we talk about gender fluidity and Anne Lister, is that she, you know, there are a lot of extracts in the diaries where you can think that that's probably what she might be talking about. At one point she says, you know, when I came home this evening, thought to myself, paraphrasing here, alas, I am neither man nor woman in society. But I think, you know, that was more about how society perceived her and what she could do and what kind of role she could play in society. What's very interesting is that Anne Lister was really traditional in how she thought about men and women's roles.
Sometimes people come in and they go, oh, you know, she must have been a lovely person, or she must have been really nice, or, you know, she was so kind of brave. And yes, she was. She was extremely brave. She was a formidable human being, an extremely impressive woman, and wildly transgressive in the time period, in the best way possible. She was also not very nice. If you read her diary, she was not the loveliest person in the world. And that's okay. People are complicated. People are difficult. It's okay to be both brave, admirable, and a little bit unpleasant.
She wasn't a proponent of, you know, the right to vote, anything like that. Women, for Anne Lister, were purely seen in like the domestic sphere, like angelic creatures. She did in later life, I think she realised that the old order was changing, and that, you know, she lamented that, and particularly in 1832 with the Great Reform Act, when she could see people from the working classes rising up against the landlords and the landowners. She knew that things were changing, and in some of her later conversations with some of her aristocratic friends, she talked about the role of women. And it's interesting to compare those diary extracts with the earlier ones. I think what's really intriguing for me is how men perceived Anne Lister. You know, her fierce intellect allowed her to, and her position as an estate owner and a landowner, not as a rich woman, but she had certain powers in her life that allowed her to behave in a certain way, and so she could compete with men. And again, but it brings us back to, you know, having a college named after her at York University. She couldn't compete with them on those terms. She wasn't allowed entry into a university.
I think being the first college named after a woman, well, it's long overdue. But then, you know, building a college at university, it isn't something you do every year. And so it's great that they've recognised, you know, that a woman and someone so significant as Anne Lister, and also being an LGBTQ figure, again, I think it's just showing how far we've come. There's obviously a lot further to go, but just how normal it is that there's, you know, it doesn't matter who you are. You know, if you've worked hard and if you've been an inspiration, you know, you should be someone who people look up to and can be inspired by.
I think the significance of a college named after Anne Lister, the effect on the LGBT community is going to be massive. I mean, for me, turning up here today, it's such an emotional experience to have this college named after a woman who 20 years ago was like a dirty secret in Halifax. And now she's somebody who's celebrated all over the world. And to have a college, an academic institution, name one of their colleges after her, it's just enormous.
And what does it mean to suddenly think across time, traditionally, right, across time, to someone you can think of as family, right, in a way, someone who's out there authorizing you both not to fit in and not care about it, right? It's okay to not fit in. You find a way, don't exaggerate it, take it directly, right? You don't hide it either, but there's a way forward, and she found it. And I feel like for LGBTQ people, having a college named after a person that strong is just invigorating, it's inspiring. But I also think, and it's my hope for the college, that we begin to see a lot more opportunities for people to cross-identify. You don't have to be LGBTQ to read alongside Ann Lister and figure out how you live each day. Like, what are we? We are all people who get up and have to put yourself together and climb the mountain of that day. And if you read Ann Lister doing that, there's nothing I can think of on earth that you can read another person doing that every day. What's the magic of that? How can I do my daily self-assembly again today? Again today. And I really hope that the college naming brings that inspiration to people beyond the LGBTQ community that don't, maybe know about it yet.
I think what's really interesting is that, all the students now that are going to York University who happen to be lucky enough to stay in this amazing new building called the Ann Lister College, they're permanently going to have Ann Lister on the tip of their tongue all the time. When people ask them, which college are you in? It's going to be, I'm in the Ann Lister College. Yeah. So how many times a day are the words Ann Lister going to be spoken? Hundreds, tens of thousands perhaps, I don't know.
It's like when we arrived here today and just seeing a name on the building, it just made me cry. Yeah. And it was like that when the news came, and just... Yeah.
When I heard that the University of York was naming a college after Ann Lister, I think I got goosebumps. I think... Yeah. I kind of said to myself, my God, Anne, you finally arrived. You have a college named after you. You couldn't go to one. You couldn't go to university. But now people are going to go to a university and go to a college named after you. And I think of all the diaries, extracts that I've transcribed, where she's reading, where she's studying, where she's talking to professors, and kind of being on the margins of that kind of academic sphere, because as a woman she couldn't be in it. So for me it's incredible and amazing, and the fact that it's happening at a Yorkshire University, thankfully, and I just think it's brilliant.
I think it's brilliant. She loved York. It was her spiritual home, really, wasn't it? Yeah.
As a college teacher myself, it's unbelievable that this has happened in a way. And I think, just want to kind of pick up a thread that of what Sally said, good on York, good on the University of York, because between Ann Lister College and also Cato College, right, which is coming right after, I feel like the University of York took the concept of inclusion in an altogether new level, to a whole new place, right? Most inclusion, efforts at inclusion, there'll be events, right? There'll be programming. And with both of these colleges, the University of York has made a kind of durable landmarks, durable LGBTQ landmarks at the heart of our common history. And it's just totally moving that has happened here.
I feel really emotional about the college. The fact of it being here, turning up today, seeing the name it really makes me feel very emotional and proud. I'm proud of York. I'm proud of the university for being the people who did this. I'm proud of Anne Lister for living. I think it's a really special day today, the opening of this college.
Finally, what I would really love you all to do is grab a party popper. Who's going to pop their party poppers